The morning sun beat down on New Terra's busiest street corner, but nobody was moving. Trucks sat idle. Delivery drones hovered in place. Even the massive cargo haulers had pulled over, their alien drivers climbing out to see what was causing the holdup. At the center of it all sat a dragon hatchling no bigger than a golden retriever. Her name was Ember, though nobody in the crowd knew that yet. Her copper scales, which should have gleamed like polished pennies in the sunlight, looked dull and lifeless. Dirt streaked her small body. Her wings drooped against her sides. But her eyes, those brilliant rainbow eyes that marked her as dragonkind, never wavered from the storm drain grate in front of her. 3 days. That's how long she'd been sitting there. The Vraxian shopkeeper from the corner store had tried everything. He'd brought out expensive meats from his cold storage, the kind that cost a week's salary. Ember hadn't even sniffed them. He'd tried sweet fruits that dragons supposedly loved. She'd ignored those too. Finally, in frustration, he'd attempted to shoo her away with a broom. The warning snap of her jaws, small as they were, had sent him scrambling backward so fast he'd knocked over his own display of imported goods. The Calthean peace officers had shown up on day 2. These weren't the friendly neighborhood watch types, these were the real deal, with their crystalline armor and stun weapons. They'd surrounded the little hatchling with all the authority their species could muster, demanding she move along. When she refused, they'd tried to pick her up by force. That had been a mistake. Ember might have been small, exhausted, and alone, but she was still a dragon. The officers had retreated with singed uniforms and wounded pride, filing reports about aggressive wildlife and public disturbances. But they hadn't come back to try again. On day 3, Ember's own mother had arrived. The sight had drawn an even bigger crowd. Adult dragons didn't come into the integration districts often. They found the mixed species chaos overwhelming, and most aliens found their presence intimidating. But here she came, her massive bronze wings casting shadows across entire buildings as she landed. The mother dragon's cries could be heard for blocks. She called to her daughter in the ancient language of their kind, sounds that resonated in your chest even if you didn't understand the words. She circled. She landed beside Ember and nudged her with a snout the size of a human torso. She even tried to pick the hatchling up by the scruff of her neck, the way mother dragons carried their young. Ember had bitten her own mother's nose. Not hard, not enough to truly injure, but enough to make her point crystal clear. She wasn't leaving. The adult dragon had sat there for nearly an hour, making sounds that could only be described as dragon mother frustration. Finally, with a roar that rattled windows 3 streets over, she'd taken off. The crowd had watched her disappear into the sky, and there'd been something almost human in the way her wings had drooped. Disappointment. Shame. Confusion. The galactic news feeds had picked up the story by then, of course. They always did when something weird happened in the integration zones. But their coverage wasn't sympathetic. Defective hatchling refuses to abandon garbage, one headline read. Mental illness suspected in dragon youth, claimed another. Alien experts appeared on talk shows, shaking their heads or their equivalent appendages, discussing how this poor creature clearly had something wrong with her brain. Dragons were supposed to be proud, they said. Noble. Strong. This pathetic display went against everything dragon culture stood for. The human pedestrians passing by had a different reaction. They didn't try to move her. They didn't call her defective. They just helped, in small ways. Someone left a bowl of water within reach. Someone else brought a tarp when rain threatened. A construction worker on lunch break sat on the curb 20 feet away and ate his sandwich in silent company, not bothering her but letting her know she wasn't completely alone. By the afternoon of day 3, Ember was barely holding on. Her head would dip toward the pavement, exhaustion winning for just a moment, before she'd jerk it back up with desperate determination. Her small sides heaved with each breath. But still, those rainbow eyes stayed locked on that storm drain grate. She could smell them down there. Hear them, in the way dragons hear, with senses humans and aliens couldn't quite understand. Her siblings were in the darkness below, and she would not leave them. Not for food. Not for comfort. Not even for her own mother. The crowd didn't understand. The news feeds mocked her. The experts called her broken. But Ember knew something they didn't, something that would soon make every species on New Terra question what they thought they knew about strength, about family, and about the value of refusing to give up on those you love. The call came through to the city maintenance department just after 2 in the afternoon. District manager reporting a wildlife obstruction at Storm Drain 47. Code requires immediate removal. The dispatcher had sighed, made a note in the system, and radioed it out to whoever was available. That turned out to be Rick Hayes. Rick had been working infrastructure maintenance on New Terra for almost 15 years. He'd fixed water mains under Calthean temples, rewired power grids in Vraxian marketplaces, and once spent 3 days knee-deep in sewage because nobody else would go down there. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work, and Rick took pride in keeping things running smoothly. He pulled up to the scene in his maintenance truck, took one look at the crowd, and almost turned around. This wasn't a normal call. News drones buzzed overhead. Alien officials stood in clusters, gesturing dramatically. Street vendors had set up shop to sell refreshments to the spectators. And right in the middle of it all sat the smallest dragon Rick had ever seen. The dispatcher hadn't mentioned it was a dragon. They'd said wildlife. Rick sat in his truck for a minute, just watching. He'd seen the news coverage that morning while eating breakfast. Everyone had. The defective hatchling story was everywhere, with alien experts debating what should be done with a dragon too stupid to take care of itself. His wife had turned off the television in disgust. That baby's trying to tell them something, she'd said. But nobody's listening. Now, seeing Ember up close, Rick understood what his wife meant. This wasn't a confused animal. The hatchling's posture was deliberate. Purposeful. Her entire being focused on that storm drain with an intensity that reminded Rick of his own daughter during her competitive swimming days, that absolute refusal to quit even when your body was screaming at you to stop. The Vraxian shopkeeper spotted Rick's maintenance uniform and practically ran over. Finally. Someone competent. Remove this creature immediately. I'm losing business by the hour. Do you know how much revenue I've lost because people can't park in front of my establishment? A Calthean official joined in. We've already filed 17 complaints. This is a public safety hazard. The hatchling is clearly diseased or damaged. It needs to be relocated to a facility. Rick pulled his toolkit from the truck bed, taking his time. He'd learned over the years that rushing never helped anything. What's she doing that's hazardous? He asked. She's blocking traffic. I can see that. But what's she actually doing? She attacking people? Destroying property? The aliens looked at each other. Well, no. But she's been here for 3 days. It's disruptive. Rick walked past them without another word. He'd dealt with enough bureaucrats, human and alien alike, to know when someone cared more about inconvenience than actually solving problems. The crowd parted as he approached, his steel-toed boots heavy on the pavement. Ember's head swiveled toward him instantly. Her eyes narrowed. A low rumble started in her chest, not quite a growl, but definitely a warning. Rick stopped about 10 feet away and did something that made the watching crowd murmur in confusion. He sat down on the curb. Not close enough to threaten her space. Not far enough to seem like he was ignoring her. Just, there. Sharing the same piece of ground. Rick had learned this trick from his old dog, Bruno, years ago. Sometimes the best way to earn trust wasn't to demand it, it was to just exist calmly nearby until the other party decided you were okay. You smell something down there, don't you, girl? Rick said quietly. He wasn't expecting an answer. Wasn't even sure she understood English. But her posture shifted slightly. The rumbling stopped. Those rainbow eyes studied him with an intelligence that made him distinctly uncomfortable. This wasn't a dumb animal. Not even close. Rick pulled out his handheld scanner, the one he used for checking pipe integrity and heat signatures. He switched it to thermal mode and aimed it at the storm drain. The screen flickered for a moment, calibrating for the darkness and the metal grating. Then the readout appeared. His stomach dropped. Heat signatures. Multiple. Faint, really faint, but definitely there. And they were in a pattern that didn't match rats or the other vermin that usually lived in the drainage system. These were larger. Clustered together. And their thermal output was way too low for anything that should still be alive. Rick ran the scan 3 more times, certain he was reading it wrong. But the results stayed consistent. Something was down there. Multiple somethings. Barely clinging to life. He looked at Ember, really looked at her, and suddenly her 3-day vigil made terrible sense. She wasn't confused or defective. She was keeping watch. Standing guard over something precious in the only way a hatchling could, by refusing to leave, by making herself impossible to ignore, by hoping that eventually someone would care enough to check. Oh, kid, Rick said softly. Why didn't anyone listen to you? Ember made a small sound, almost like a whimper. It was the first noise she'd made in 3 days that wasn't aggressive. Rick stood up and pulled out his radio. The crowd pressed closer, sensing something was happening. The Vraxian shopkeeper started complaining again about lost revenue. The Calthean officials began talking about protocols and procedures and proper channels. Rick ignored all of them. Dispatch, this is Hayes. I need a full excavation crew at Storm Drain 47. Priority Alpha. The radio crackled. Priority Alpha? Rick, that's for critical infrastructure failures. This is just an animal removal. I'm upgrading it. Get me a crew, get me lifting equipment, and get me someone from emergency services. We're opening this drain now. Do you have authorization for? Rick clicked off the radio. He'd apologize for the insubordination later. Maybe he'd even get written up. But he'd been doing this job long enough to know when the rules needed to bend. He'd also been a father long enough to recognize desperate hope when he saw it. The human capacity to take a creature seriously, even when everyone else had written it off, was about to teach this crowd an uncomfortable lesson. Rick just hoped whatever was down in that darkness was still alive to be saved. Ember watched him gather his equipment, and for the first time in 3 days, something like relief flickered across her small face. Finally, someone understood. The excavation crew arrived 40 minutes later, and they weren't happy about it. Tommy Chen, Rick had specifically requested he not use that name, so let's call him Tommy Wilson, the crew chief, climbed out of his truck shaking his head. You know the paperwork this is gonna generate, right? Priority Alpha for a storm drain? The boss is gonna have our heads. Rick was already setting up the work zone, placing safety cones and warning barriers. There's something alive down there, Tommy. Multiple somethings. We open this drain or I'm calling the media myself. That got Tommy's attention. The last thing the maintenance department needed was bad press, especially with how the Galactic News had been covering the defective Hatchling story. He looked at Ember, still sitting vigil by the grate, and something in his expression softened. All right. Let's do this by the book though. I'm not losing my pension over a hunch. By the time they had the lifting equipment in place, the crowd had tripled in size. News drones jockeyed for position overhead. Alien reporters set up camera equipment. The Vraxian shopkeeper had apparently decided that if he couldn't get rid of the obstruction, he might as well profit from it. He was now selling premium viewing spots on his rooftop for 50 credits each. Rick noticed something else too. More humans had shown up. Construction workers on their lunch break. Office employees who'd left work early. A whole group of human students who'd ditched class. They weren't here to gawk. They stood quietly at the edges of the crowd, arms crossed, watching with intense focus. One woman held a sign that simply read, "Listen to her." The xenobiologists arrived next, a group of them from the university. They pushed their way to the front, instruments in hand, already arguing amongst themselves. Rick caught snippets of their conversation as he worked. Probably detected a dead animal. Dragons have strong olfactory senses but poor judgment at this age. I'm betting on a nest of drain rats. The hatchling likely imprinted on their sounds. 5 credits says there's nothing down there at all. The creature is simply confused. They were making bets. Actual bets. On whether a desperate child's vigil meant anything. Rick's jaw tightened, but he kept working. He'd let the drain speak for itself. The grate itself was massive, about 6 feet across, solid steel, designed to handle the runoff from an entire district. It took all 4 crew members on the winch to start lifting it. The metal groaned as it rose, decades of sediment and rust fighting against their efforts. Ember scrambled backward, giving them room but never taking her eyes off the opening. As the grate cleared the drain shaft, the smell hit them. Stagnant water, rotting vegetation, and something else. Something that made Rick's chest tighten with worry. He grabbed his high-powered work light and clipped a safety harness around his waist. "Rick, maybe let me go down first," Tommy said. "You're not exactly." "I'm going." Rick's tone left no room for argument. This was his call. His responsibility. And if he was wrong, if this turned out to be nothing, he wanted to be the one who looked foolish, not his crew. The ladder into the drain was slick with algae and who knew what else. Rick descended slowly, the light attached to his helmet cutting through the darkness below. The shaft went down about 15 feet before it opened into a larger tunnel, part of the old drainage system that dated back to New Terra's first settlement. His boots hit standing water with a splash. The tunnel stretched in both directions, disappearing into darkness. But his thermal scanner was pointing to the left, so that's where Rick headed, sloshing through ankle-deep water that he tried very hard not to think about. 50 feet in, his light caught something that didn't belong. The tunnel wall had been hollowed out, creating a small cave-like depression just above the waterline. And in that hollow, pressed together in a tiny heap, were 4 dragon hatchlings. Rick's breath caught in his throat. They were even smaller than Ember. Their scales had lost all color, faded to a sickly gray that looked wrong in every possible way. Their breathing was so shallow he almost couldn't see their sides moving. One of them had its eyes half open, but there was no awareness there, no reaction to his light. "Dear God," Rick whispered. He triggered his radio with shaking hands. "Tommy, drop me down the emergency rescue kit. Now. And call for medical, tell them we need xenobiologists who actually know how to help, not the idiots making bets up there." "Rick, what did you find?" "4 dragon hatchlings. Barely alive. Move." The noise from the crowd above changed instantly. The mocking tones, the casual conversation, all of it died away. Rick could hear someone shouting, relaying the information. Then chaos erupted, voices overlapping, people running, the xenobiologists suddenly very interested in coming down to see for themselves. But Rick wasn't waiting for them. The rescue kit dropped down on a rope, and he grabbed it, moving to the hollow. The hatchlings were cold to the touch. Dragons were supposed to maintain their own body heat, but these babies had nothing left to give. He wrapped them carefully in the thermal blankets from the kit, his hands surprisingly gentle for someone used to working with wrenches and welding torches. "I've got you," he murmured, knowing they probably couldn't hear him. "Your sister didn't give up on you. We're not gonna give up either." Getting them out took precision Rick didn't know he had. Each hatchling went into a separate rescue sling, secured carefully so the lift wouldn't hurt them. Tommy and the crew raised them one at a time, and Rick watched each ascent with his heart hammering, certain that at any moment he'd hear that one of them hadn't made it. When the 4th hatchling reached the surface, Rick climbed up after them. He emerged from the drain to find the scene completely transformed. The mocking xenobiologists were silent, their instruments hanging forgotten in their hands. The betting had stopped. Several of the aliens in the crowd looked physically ill. Because spread out on thermal blankets, surrounded by emergency medical equipment that the human crew had scrambled to assemble, were 4 impossible survivors. Dragons that should have been dead 5 times over. Hatchlings that had somehow clung to life in freezing water, in total darkness, without food, for what must have been close to a week. And the only reason they'd survived at all was because one small hatchling had sat vigil for 3 days, refusing to abandon them, waiting for someone to care enough to look. Ember pushed past the medical personnel, and nobody tried to stop her. She reached her siblings and immediately pressed against them, making sounds Rick had never heard before, desperate chirps and whistles, trying to share what little warmth she had left. The crowd was completely silent now. Even the news drones had stopped moving, just hovering in place, cameras fixed on the scene below. One of the human students who'd been holding the "listen to her" sign was crying. Tommy had turned away, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. And Rick stood there, looking at the xenobiologist who'd been making bets, and said very quietly, "Still think she's defective?" Nobody answered. They couldn't. Because everyone there, human and alien alike, had just learned exactly what they'd been ignoring for 3 days. And the shame of it hung in the air like smoke. The medical bay at New Terra General smelled like antiseptic and desperation. Rick had followed the ambulances there, still in his work clothes, still covered in drain muck. Nobody had questioned his presence. Maybe they figured anyone who'd pulled 4 dying hatchlings out of a storm drain had earned the right to see what happened next. The scene inside was controlled chaos. Human doctors worked alongside Vraxian specialists, their usual territorial disputes forgotten in the face of genuine emergency. The 4 rescued hatchlings were spread across heated examination tables, their gray scales slowly, painfully slowly, beginning to show hints of color again. Ember sat between 2 of the tables, refusing to be separated from her siblings despite multiple attempts to remove her. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, wait, Rick had asked for simple American names. Let's call her Dr. Beth Morrison, the head of xenobiology, was running scans with equipment that probably cost more than Rick made in a year. Her face grew more troubled with each reading. "This doesn't make sense," she muttered, loud enough for Rick to hear. Core temperature was 72 degrees when they arrived. Respiratory rate at 4 breaths per minute. They should be dead. They should have been dead days ago. Rick leaned against the wall, watching through the observation window. He'd called his wife an hour ago to tell her he'd be late for dinner. She'd already seen the news coverage. "You did good, honey," she'd said. "Real good." He'd had to end the call before she heard his voice crack. A commotion at the entrance made everyone look up. A team from the city engineering department had arrived, led by a woman Rick recognized, Denise Wu. No wait, simple names. Denise Patterson. She was the forensic infrastructure analyst, the person they called when something went really wrong and they needed to know why. She didn't look happy. "Rick Hayes?" she called out, spotting him through the window. I need to talk to you. Now. They met in a small conference room down the hall. Denise dropped a tablet on the table between them with enough force to make Rick flinch. On the screen was a technical schematic of Storm Drain 47 and the surrounding underground system. I've been analyzing the drain since your crew opened it, Denise said. Her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Running structural reports, checking maintenance logs, pulling security footage. Rick, that grate didn't fail naturally. Rick's stomach dropped. What do you mean? I mean someone sealed it. Deliberately. She swiped through images on the tablet. See this? Quickset polymer compound. Industrial grade. It was applied to the drainage holes 3 days before that hatchling started her vigil. Whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. They sealed the holes just enough to trap anything inside while still allowing minimal water flow so it wouldn't back up and trigger flood sensors. The room felt suddenly cold. You're saying someone trapped those hatchlings on purpose? I'm saying someone tried to kill them. Denise pulled up more files. And I've got security footage of who did it. The video showed a Calthian contractor in an official city vest working on Storm Drain 47. The timestamp read 5 days ago. He was methodical, professional, sealing drain after drain along the street with the polymer compound. When he reached Drain 47, he paused, looked around to make sure nobody was watching, and spent extra time on that particular grate. His name is Veltor Kess, Denise said. Contracted through the district council for what they called pest control maintenance. I pulled the work order. Rick, it specifically mentions reducing invasive species population in accordance with district integration protocols. Invasive species. Rick's voice came out flat. Dangerous. They mean the dragons. I've got the council meeting minutes from 2 weeks ago. Denise kept scrolling. Direct quote from council member Thexlar. The dragon population in the integration district has grown too aggressive. Traditional relocation methods have failed. Perhaps natural selection will ease our integration tensions. Rick stared at the tablet, reading the words over and over. Natural selection. They'd written it down. Put it in official minutes. Like it was just another agenda item between budget approvals and zoning changes. There's more, Denise said quietly. Veltor wasn't the only contractor. They had teams working on pest control across 6 districts. Sealed storm drains, closed off ventilation shafts, even pumped certain chemicals into areas where dragons were known to nest. All authorized. All documented. All completely legal under the current species management codes. How many? Rick asked. How many hatchlings? We don't know yet. Search and rescue is checking every sealed location now. But Rick. Denise's professional composure cracked slightly. Some of those seals went in 2 weeks ago. If there were hatchlings trapped in those locations, they're not alive anymore. Rick stood up so fast his chair fell over. He needed to move, to do something, because if he sat still with this information he was going to put his fist through the wall. The council knew. They authorized genocide and called it pest control. The word genocide is going to be the legal debate, Denise warned. Their lawyers are already arguing that hatchlings don't qualify for sentient being protections under current integration law. They're calling them precognitive juveniles and claiming this falls under wildlife management. Wildlife management. Rick laughed, but there was no humor in it. Those babies down the hall aren't wildlife. That hatchling who sat outside for 3 days trying to save her family, she's not some dumb animal. She knew. She understood. And we ignored her. His radio crackled. It was Tommy from the maintenance crew. Rick, you need to turn on the news. Any channel. Now. Denise pulled up a news feed on her tablet. Every major station was carrying the same story. Someone, Rick suspected one of the human students from earlier, had leaked everything. The sealed drains. The work orders. The council meeting minutes. But what really had the galaxy's attention was a recording Rick didn't even know existed. It was his own voice, captured by someone's phone during the rescue. Clear as day, you could hear him talking to the hatchlings as he pulled them out. I've got you. Your sister didn't give up on you. We're not gonna give up either. That clip, combined with footage of the barely alive hatchlings being raised from the drain, had gone viral across human networks. Earth, the colonies, the outer settlements, everywhere humans lived, they were watching. And they were furious. The comments section was a wall of rage. They tried to kill children and called it paperwork. This is what happens when bureaucrats get to define who counts as a person. Every human on New Terra needs to walk off the job until this gets fixed. Rick's phone started buzzing. Text messages from human workers across the city. Mechanics, engineers, doctors, teachers. All saying the same thing: when do we strike? He looked at Denise, who was staring at her own flood of messages. It's already starting, she said. Human-run businesses in the integration district are closing. The construction crews just walked off 3 major projects. The power station called. Their human staff is threatening a walkout if the council members aren't arrested by morning. The news feed showed the district council building, where protesters were already gathering. Mostly humans, but Rick spotted other species too. Dragons, obviously, but also some Vraxians and even a few Calthians, holding signs that read "Justice for the hatchlings" and "Children are not pests." Back in the medical bay, Dr. Beth Morrison appeared at the conference room door. Her expression was carefully neutral, but Rick could see the storm behind her eyes. "They're going to make it," she said. "All 4 of them. It'll take weeks of recovery, but they'll survive." She paused. "Rick, the mother dragon arrived about 10 minutes ago. I don't think I've ever seen a dragon cry before. She keeps trying to touch Ember through the observation glass. She won't leave." Rick nodded slowly. "Let her in. Let them all be together. I don't care what the regulations say." "Already done," Dr. Beth said. "And Rick?" "The council just issued a statement. They're calling this an unfortunate misunderstanding, and promising a full investigation." Investigation. Rick picked up the tablet with the evidence files. "No. We're way past investigations. Denise, send me everything you've got. Every file, every recording, every piece of evidence. I want it in the hands of every news outlet and legal advocate on New Terra by tonight." "Rick, that's going to start a firestorm." "Good. Those hatchlings were 3 days away from dying alone in the dark because nobody in power thought they mattered. Let it burn." The strike started at dawn. Rick woke up to his phone exploding with notifications. The human workers group chat, which usually handled shift swaps and birthday announcements, had turned into a coordination center overnight. Power plant workers, water treatment specialists, transit operators, construction crews. Every human who kept New Terra running had apparently decided enough was enough. By the time Rick got to the maintenance depot, the parking lot was full but the building was empty. Instead, everyone had gathered outside, standing in quiet solidarity. Tommy was there with the entire excavation crew. The welders from District 3. Even old Jerry from accounting, who nobody thought cared about anything except spreadsheets. "We're not going in," Tommy said simply. "None of us. Not until the council members are charged and those laws get changed." Rick looked at the crowd, easily 200 workers, maybe more. "You all know what this means, right? We could lose our jobs. Our contracts. The city could bring in replacement workers from other colonies." A woman from the electrical division stepped forward. Her name was Angela Rodriguez. No wait, Angela Foster. She'd been on New Terra for 20 years, longer than almost anyone. "Let them try. You know how long it took me to learn the quirks of this planet's power grid? 6 years. You know how long it'll take some replacement crew that doesn't give a damn? They'll have blackouts within a week." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. She was right, and everyone knew it. New Terra's infrastructure was a complicated patchwork of human engineering, alien technology, and improvised solutions that only worked because the people running it actually understood the systems. You couldn't just swap that out overnight. Rick's radio crackled. It was the city manager's office, already demanding to know where his crew was. He turned the radio off without answering. The news drones found them within an hour. But this time, the coverage was different. The reporters weren't mocking or dismissive. They were documenting something the galaxy hadn't seen before: humans walking away from their jobs not for money or benefits, but for a principle. 4-5 dragon hatchlings that most species still didn't consider worth the trouble. By noon, the strike had spread beyond just city workers. Human-owned restaurants in the integration district put up signs, "Closed until justice is served." Medical clinics run by human doctors went to emergency-only operations. The human teachers at the integration schools held their classes outside the district council building, turning their lesson plans into civics education about why some fights matter more than paychecks. Rick found himself at the hospital that afternoon, not because he had any official reason to be there, but because he needed to see them. The hatchlings. To know that pulling them out of that drain had meant something. The recovery room was transformed. Someone had brought in heat lamps that mimicked sunlight. The sterile medical equipment had been pushed to the sides, making room for soft bedding. And in the center of it all, Ember lay curled around her 4 siblings, their scales slowly regaining their natural colors: copper, bronze, silver, and deep forest green. The mother dragon was there too, massive and magnificent, taking up half the room. She should have been terrifying. Instead, she just looked tired and grateful. When she saw Rick, she made a sound, low and rumbling, but somehow gentle. Her head lowered in what could only be described as a bow. Rick's throat tightened. "Just doing what should have been done 3 days ago," he said quietly. Dr. Beth Morrison was checking the hatchling's vital signs, her movements careful around the protective mother. "Their recovery is remarkable," she said. "Core temperatures are almost normal. They're even starting to eat. That silver one tried to bite my stethoscope this morning." She smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Rick, I've been practicing xenobiology for 15 years. I've written papers on dragon physiology. And I walked past that hatchling for 2 days thinking she was just confused. You weren't the only one. That doesn't make it better." Dr. Beth set down her tablet. "The university wants me to write a report on this. Professional analysis of what went wrong. You know what the real finding is going to be? We stopped seeing them as children and started seeing them as problems. And once that happens, once you reduce someone to a category in a policy document, it becomes really easy to justify anything." The sound of chanting filtered through the window. The protest outside the council building had grown. Rick could see it on the news feed, thousands of people now, not just humans anymore. Dragon families had flown in from the outer settlements. Even some Vraxians and Caltheans had joined, the ones who were horrified by what their council representatives had authorized in their names. The trial started 3 days later. The Calthean contractor, Veltor Kess, and 4 council members were charged with multiple violations. The prosecution was still arguing over whether attempted genocide would stick or if they'd have to settle for lesser charges like reckless endangerment and abuse of authority. Rick attended every day of the trial, sitting in the public gallery with Tommy and Angela and dozens of other humans who'd walked off their jobs. The evidence was damning. The work orders. The meeting minutes. The security footage. The defendant's own logs showing exactly which drains he'd sealed and when. But what really shifted the proceedings was when Ember herself was brought in, not as evidence, but as a witness. The defense had argued that hatchlings lacked the cognitive ability to understand what had happened to them. That they were presentient, operating on pure instinct. Then Ember walked into that courtroom, looked directly at Veltor Kess, and snarled with such focused hatred that 3 guards had to step between them. It wasn't animal rage. It was the fury of someone who understood exactly what had been done to her family and wanted everyone in that room to know she remembered. The defense rested their case shortly after that. The verdict came down on a Wednesday. Guilty on all counts. The contractor got 10 years. The council members got varying sentences, but more importantly, they were removed from office immediately. But the real victory wasn't the convictions, it was what happened next. The new Terra Congress passed emergency legislation, fast-tracked through every committee, that completely rewrote the integration codes. Dragon hatchlings were granted full sentient being protections from the moment they hatched. Pest control operations in integration districts now required xenobiological review and public comment periods. And perhaps most significantly, any government official found to have authorized harm to minors of any species could face immediate removal and criminal charges. The humans went back to work after that. But something had fundamentally changed in the integration districts. Dragon families who'd previously avoided the mixed species areas started moving in, seeking out human neighborhoods specifically. They'd leave thank you gifts on doorsteps, usually shiny objects or hand-carved trinkets. The message was clear: they trusted humans to see their children as children, not as problems to be managed. Rick went back to fixing storm drains and water mains, back to the unglamorous work of keeping a city running. But there was one change to his routine. Every Friday, he'd stop by a small apartment in the residential district, the one where Ember and her siblings had been placed with a foster family while they finished growing. The hatchlings would mob him the moment he walked in, climbing over each other to get to the human who'd listened when nobody else would. They were getting bigger now, their wings strong enough for short flights, their scales gleaming with health. Ember always got to him first, chirping that same grateful sound she'd made the day he'd opened the drain. Rick would sit on the floor and let them climb all over him, tiny claws catching on his work clothes, warm bodies pressing against him with absolute trust. And he'd think about how close it had come. How 3 more days and there would have been nothing to save. How easy it had been for the galaxy to dismiss a desperate child because she didn't fit their definition of what mattered. On one of those visits, Ember did something that made Rick's wife, who'd come along this time, start crying. The little dragon carefully pulled something from the pile of treasures she'd been collecting and brought it to Rick. It was his old work badge, the one he'd lost during the rescue. She'd kept it. Treasured it. The way dragons treasured the things they loved most. "You're her hero," Rick's wife whispered, watching Ember curl up against his leg. Rick shook his head, looking at the small dragon who'd sat vigil for 3 days, who'd refused to abandon her family even when the whole world told her she was broken for caring. "No," he said quietly. "She's mine." The lesson had been taught. The galaxy had learned, or at least been reminded, that humanity didn't measure worth by convenience. They didn't save only the easy cases or the ones that made political sense. They saved the desperate, the stubborn, the ones everyone else had given up on. And they'd keep doing it, one storm drain at a time, for as long as it took.